I'm running because Alaska is at a crossroads. It's time for leadership, and what we have in Juneau right now is not good leadership. Well, I've been pretty disappointed for most of my life with party politics. I don't like the bickering that goes back and forth. I don't like the stone throwing. And it just seems like you get a line drawn in the sand and the Republicans pick one side, the Democrats pick the other side. They rarely ever work together, and Alaskans are just put on the sidelines and suffer through it all. We would like to see more get done in Juneau, but we're really left wanting. Well, unfortunately, Alaska is dependent primarily on one revenue source, and that's oil. Our revenue source is at a 30-year low, and our spending is at an all-time high. That's a problem for Alaska, and there's a looming fiscal cliff that is just around the corner. And if we don't take care of the problem today, then we're leaving that problem to our children and to our grandchildren. And Bill Walker and I are not going to stand for that. Alaska's education system isn't working. We have some of the lowest performance in the country and the highest costs. And our current mayor of Anchorage wants to take his failing system and replicate it throughout the state. That's not going to work. Alaska leads the nation in violent crime, sexual assault, and suicide rates. And unfortunately, we have reduced the number of troopers by about 25%. We're at an all-time low. And it's difficult to combat crime when you're not providing enough troopers. The solution that the current administration has presented to Alaskans is to put more VPSOs out in the villages. Now that on the surface is an all right idea, but the problem is that they're not fully equipped to handle the problems that are out there. They can't carry weapons, and really they can't engage any kind of violent criminal behavior as it's taking place out in the communities. All they can do is stand back and watch and call a trooper and wait for him to come in. What we need to do is focus on better training so that we can put more qualified police officers out in rural Alaska. Alaska has a great constitution in that it says that we will manage our fish and game resources for abundance and for sustained yield. Unfortunately, our salmon populations, our moose populations are not being managed for sustained yield. We're not meeting escapement goals throughout Alaska for salmon, and unfortunately we're not able to meet subsistence or personal use needs. So I'm a wildlife biologist by training, and I've worked as a wildlife manager for about 20 years now. I worked in tribal government as a fish and game, as a wildlife manager primarily, and most recently I worked at the Department of Fish and Game as the Director of Subsistence Division and the Deputy Commissioner for Wildlife Subsistence and Habitat. And just before then I was on the Board of Game. Alaska has a statutory obligation and a constitutional obligation to manage for abundance and manage with the sustained yield principle in mind. And unfortunately, it seems like we've forgotten those principles. We don't have the abundant resources that we've had in the past. Our salmon populations are suffering. Our moose populations are in decline all over the state. And we need to get back to the basics. We need to manage our fish and game resources for abundance as our framers of the Constitution had in mind. I have probably 20 years of experience in Arctic policy, and I spent about 10 years working as a permanent participant to the Arctic Council. All of my career has been spent in Arctic policy because I'm an Arctic resident, just like most other Alaskans. We're all Arctic residents. Alaska has to be at the table when we're talking Arctic policy. Unfortunately, the decisions are all being made in DC or Portland or Seattle, but they're not being made in Alaska. What everyone needs to keep in mind is that Alaska is the reason that the United States is an Arctic nation. And we should be at the forefront for all the decision making that takes place. We shouldn't be relying on Washington, D.C. We shouldn't be relying on Seattle or Portland or any other place. Alaskans should be leading the decision making because it's going to affect our lives. So Senator French and Mayor Sullivan have both proposed that just a few extra jobs and maybe a little bit of cheaper energy is going to be the solution to all of the problems in rural Alaska. But that's not a solution for rural Alaska. If we're going to make a solution that'll last in our villages around the state, then we have to work with rural Alaskans. We have to go and communicate with the folks in each of the villages. You can't develop solutions from Juneau. You can't develop solutions in Anchorage for all of rural Alaska. They need to be developed in conjunction with rural residents, and that's what we're going to do. Well, one of the greatest benefits of running as an independent is that we are like-minded with the majority of Alaskans. 53% of Alaskans consider themselves undeclared or independents, like Bill Walker and I. And we believe that we're much closer to the majority of Alaskans and have similar viewpoints, similar backgrounds, and we're not bound by party politics. We're not going to be held to the party platforms or owned by party leadership. Some of the things that we propose to do are developing our infrastructure. Alaska is sorely lacking in infrastructure, and we've been hearing from our political leaders for decades that they're going to develop infrastructure. Alaska needs roads, it needs ports, it needs rail. There are no other ways that we're going to get to the resources that are out there in order to keep Alaska's budget, in order to pay for the things that Alaska needs. We have to develop our infrastructure, and Bill Walker and I will do that. Bill Walker and I are going to defend the sovereignty of Alaska, and that includes our infrastructure development. We can't sit idly by while Washington, D.C. decides when and where we can build a road, which moose we can harvest, or where we can drive our four-wheelers and snow machines. Those decisions need to be left up to Alaskans. And Bill Walker and I are going to stand strong, defending Alaska's sovereignty and ensuring that we develop the resources that will enable us to be a strong state. I'm Craig Fleener, and I'm running as your independent candidate for Lieutenant Governor.